Welcome to part 2 of my challenge to Israel Finkelstein, who claims that David and Solomon are mythical characters, yet he dates Solomon's buildings in the early 9th century, which should have clued him in on dating Solomon to the early 9th century and challenging the Assyrian dating, which he uses the 763 BCE eclipse along with Babylonian dating to ultimately make his choices as far as what historically happened back then. Generally, though, Assyriologists use the astronomical dating for the dating of the Assyrian period forward. That means the Neo-Babylonian period and the Persian period. But pottery dating, stratigraphy, and radiocarbon-14 dating are used prior to the Assyrian period. And that scientific evidence is what is in agreement with the 709 BCE dating for the Assyrian period rather than 763. What if there's a conflict, though, between the scientific dating, the archaeological dating, and the Assyrian period dating? If a conflict between archaeological dating based on radiocarbon-14 or pottery conflicts with the astronomical dating from the Assyrian period dated to 763, the archaeologists cop out to the 763 eclipse every time. Radiocarbon-14 dating from Rehov, however, for the year of Shishak's invasion, agrees with the VAT 4956 511 BCE dating for year 37 of Nebuchadnezzar, which in turn uses the 709 BCE eclipse, the original Assyrian eclipse, to date the Assyrian period. All three of these references are in complete agreement, which brings us to Professor Finkelstein. A quote from Israel Finkelstein, page 142 of his Bible Unearthed, says that the finds now dated to the time just before David in the late 11th century belong to the mid-10th century, and those dated to the time of Solomon belong to the early 9th century BCE. The new dates place the appearance of monumental structures, fortifications, and other signs of full statehood precisely at the time of their first appearance in the rest of the Levant. What he's talking about is the end of the Philistine pottery period that he clearly dates well into the 10th century is when David should have appeared, and the monumental buildings and palaces and etc. that have been found are dated to the early 9th century, and so there's a conflict. Based upon that dating, though, purely based on 763 eclipse, Israel Finkelstein believes that David and Solomon must be mythical, rather than simply dating David and Solomon 54 years later so that they fit their own archaeology. And that's what we're basically dealing with now. So basically the challenge is to just date David and Solomon where they belong archaeologically, since there's evidence that they were in a later period, rather than claiming since the 763 BCE eclipse dates them earlier than that they're mythical. Here's a quote from Israel Finkelstein about RC14, the new methods of radiocarbon-14 dating. He says this on page 141. Until recently, it was impossible to use radiocarbon dating for such relatively modern periods as the Iron Age because of its wide margin of probability, often extending over a century or more. But refinements of carbon-14 dating techniques have greatly reduced the margin of uncertainty. So Israel Finkelstein right here is saying that radiocarbon-14 dating is really specific now and can be used for very accurate dating for this period. In specific regard to radiocarbon-14 dating, Israel Finkelstein links RC14 readings from Rehov, City 4, with the Solomonic level of Megiddo, and thus to the time of Shishak's invasion. Israel Finkelstein says in the Bible and Radiocarbon Dating, Archaeology, Text and Science, page 304, an article he wrote in the book, that our central claim, which will be discussed below, is that Tel Rehov, City 4, not 5, is the contemporary of Megiddo 5A4B. This means that the new Tel Rehov readings actually support the low chronology system, according to which the Megiddo Ashlar palaces date to the early 19th century BCE. Those palaces are the buildings that are associated with Solomon by archaeologists, which is now confirmed by radiocarbon 14 to be in the early 9th century BCE. Another quote underscoring the significance of the radiocarbon 14 dating from Tel Rehov is as follows. Although radiocarbon dating of the Iron Age period can be treacherous due to the wide margins of error involved, short-lived grains of wheat, barley, and other plants can often be dated with reasonable accuracy. At Tel Rehov there is a major destruction layer associated with hand-burnished pottery. Radiocarbon dating of charged grains from this layer, which Mazar believes corresponds to the Shishak invasion, gave dates ranging from about 916 to 832 BC. This is City 4 level that was discussed later that's associated with the Solomonic palaces at Megiddo. Now let's actually look at some charts for radiocarbon 14 dating from City 4 of Rehov. This is it. This is the destructive level of that city, and as you can see there is a very distinctive peak pointing to a very narrow range of dates. This very narrow range of dates would be closest to the true date of the fall of this city, and it would fall somewhere between 874 and 867 BCE, which is where that peak is actually pointing to per the chart graphed. And if we use the 95.4% probability range, we can simply calculate precisely the middle of that range, which also falls within that very narrow range of dates. That probability range is from 918 to 823. We add those two numbers together to get 1741, then divide by 2 to find the center of the range, which is 870.5, which turns out to be 871 BCE. So that would be our highest probability date based upon the new radiocarbon 14 technique. Of course, the significance of the middle of the range has to do with the random sampling. They discovered that when they test these samples multiple times, the highest weighted average always ends up in the middle of the range. And so you can see from this chart that the middle of the range is where the highest peak is. So that's the significance, and that's why we can use radiocarbon 14 dating now to point to a specific year. Now that we have a really great date for Shishak's invasion, it's time to compare the two eclipses, 763 versus 709. In that case, Shishak's invasion falls in either 925 BCE or 871 BCE. Where have I heard that date before? So the 709 BCE eclipse gives us much better dating. When we place ourselves, compare these dates on the chart, 925 BCE falls very low, within a 5% range if we use that scale from 0 to 1 as percentages from 0 to 100%. The 871 BC is a 99% compatibility for the true date for the fall of Rehov. So that's very impressive.